Hello and welcome back everybody. Today we're going to do Kingdom Come Deliverance II on ARC GPU. Every ARC GPU from the A310 to the A770 on the Alchemist and B570 and 580 on the Battle Mage. I'm going to test that at 1080p at different settings. The best settings for each card. The default settings. Low, I'll leave everything at low. High, everything at high. I'm also going to test it with FSR and no FSR. And a target FPS of playable. Now this game doesn't support XeSS, so we're going to use FSR. Welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. The base hardware for testing going to be the i5 12600K and 32GB of RAM. Starting off with the A310 at 1080p, lowest settings, no FSR, we get an average of 32 FPS in city, about 40 FPS in the wild. Having the GPU peg at 99% of utilization and using 5.8GB of VRAM out of 4. So we go sucking up 1.8GB of VRAM out of the RAM. So out of 32GB of RAM, we're now using 14.2GB. Compared to the proposed minimum requirement, while using 1080p and lowest settings, I was barely using 10GB of RAM. And if you go and enable FSR quality, you get an average of 44 FPS in city, 49 in the wild. But now we're using up to 6.2GB of VRAM and the GPU only have 4. But it is playable and the frame time graph is quite stable and smooth. Now jumping to the ARC A380, this is a 6GB of VRAM card, so we should be a bit better. And I was also able to crank a bit the settings from low to medium. And without FSR, I was reaching 38 FPS in city and 55 in the wild, with the GPU peg at 99% and using 5.2GB of VRAM. So we still only on the VRAM of the card without using RAM as VRAM. So without using RAM as VRAM, we went down to 11.5GB of RAM utilization. And if you want to enable FSR quality, that will boost a little bit the FPS, having 47 in the cities and 61 in the wilds. But doing so also cost us on the VRAM. We're now using 6.2GB of VRAM out of 6. So we back on using the RAM as VRAM. Now using 13GB of RAM. Not that is a bad thing, but you may encounter a little bit of stuttering here and there. Upgrading to the A580, this is an 8GB VRAM card and still one of my favorite if you can put your hands on one. Medium settings, we get 101 FPS using 5.1GB of VRAM. High settings, we get 83 FPS using 5.3GB of VRAM. Ultra, getting 52 FPS using 6.8GB of VRAM. And Ultra with FSR quality, we get 59 FPS using 7GB of VRAM. And obviously you get more FPS when you're running in the wild, in the forest, or in the field. But this is highly playable. You just have to decide which settings you want to have. Better quality, lower FPS, or higher FPS and lower visual quality. And maybe it's limit, maybe you can play at 1440p at low settings, who knows? Not me, I didn't try. Next up is the A750. I have the Elden Ring edition, if that means anything. 1080p ultra settings. Without FSR, we get an average of 55 FPS in city and 101 in the wild. That's quite a wild gap. And when you enable FSR quality, you reach 63 FPS in cities and 120 in the wild. In both cases, FSR or no FSR, the GPU is pegged at 99% and the VRAM utilization is similar to the A580, being an 8GB VRAM card. Without FSR, we are at 6.2 and with FSR, we are at 7.1GB of VRAM utilization. That's quite a decent amount left. If it gets a bit more heated or have more shaders or assets need to be loaded, we have some space. And for the best quality visual and FPS, I recommend you to play at high without any FSR. You'll be over 60 FPS all the time without compromising any visual quality. Now upgrading to the A770, I have the LE edition, limited edition, 16GB of VRAM, but now instead of 1080p, we're playing at 1440p ultra settings. And even though the card have 16GB of VRAM, we were only using a maximum 7.4, giving us an average FPS at ultra settings 51 in the city and 63 in the wild. While you enable FSR quality, in the city you get 59 FPS and in the wild just over 70. Even though this card should be a 1440p GPU, I don't think the game take full advantage of what it can offer. And it would be nice if the dev decide to implement XeSS or even XeSS 2.0 or frame gen. That will give Intel GPU to shine a little bit. And finally, Battle Mage, the baby of the gang, the B570. For now, it's the baby at least. Still at 1440p. I know this card should be 1080p GPU, but we can play at 1440p. At ultra settings, we get an average of 39 FPS in city and 61 in wild. While you enable FSR quality, you get 51 FPS in cities and 70 in the wild. And if you want to have a more stable, higher FPS, dropping from ultra to high settings give you more FPS and more stable gameplay. Or you can just literally play at 1080p, where the card belongs. The card is pegged at 100% and using 7.9 GB of VRAM. And the frame time is super stable and smooth, making this GPU a perfect fit for this game. And finally, the card that everyone was waiting, the A580. This card is where it should be at 1440p. We're now at the ultra settings. Without FSR, we have an average of 55 FPS in cities and 63 in the wild. As for enabling FSR quality, we get 68 FPS in city and 74 in the wild. We are only using 9.4 GB of VRAM out of 12. The frame time frame graph is perfectly smooth. The only issue is, can you get your hand on one? It's definitely highly playable, and you probably drop the settings to high to maximize your FPS without losing too much visual quality. Actually, from high to ultra, I don't see any difference in visual quality. And again, if they can implement XeSS 2.0 frame gen and whatever, that would be a big help. Not that the B series really need it, but it's always nice to have more game implementing new technology. So to conclude, every ARC GPU from the A310 to the B580 can all play this game from 1080p to 1440p to different settings. And while editing, I went to check the stock of the B580. In the neighboring store, I have a 4 Canada computer, easily reachable, and they have a total of 3 B580 spread into 2 stores, and it's the LE variant. They probably just receive it because I check the store every 2-3 days. So tell me in the comments, are you using Alchemist, Battle Mage, or intend to get one? And if you have one, did you encounter any issue? In which game? And on that note, thanks for watching, see you on the next one, and subscribe!